Marla Thorne had never seen a castle, not even in the faded ink drawings that lined the back pages of the penny fables passed from hand to hand along the fishing coast. Her world had been boats and brine, hills slick with fog, hands red from gutting mackerel in the early dawn. And yet here she was, seated upright and shivering in the corner of a velvet-lined coach, climbing steadily through a valley of bare-limbed trees that clawed the sky like the fingers of old women begging to be remembered. She wore the best dress her village could sew, pale blue with a hem uneven enough to betray the rush in its making. Around her neck hung a borrowed silver cross that had belonged to the widow Elsida's daughter, dead 3 winters past. The coach's wheels hummed over the stone path in a rhythm, so even it felt ceremonial, like a funeral march made for one. Her hands, folded neatly in her lap, betrayed her only in the raw skin beneath her knuckles, proof that she had not been born for velvet. The sun had dropped behind the hills an hour before the castle finally emerged from the thinning trees. It did not look like the fairy tale Keep's the traveling plays had described, with banners snapping in the wind and windows spilling golden light onto terraces blooming with roses. Instead, it sat cold and still atop a high ridge, its towers ash-gray and the great central dome dark against the deepening sky. No music, no torches, no procession. Just stone walls and a wooden gate that groaned on its hinges as a coachman, an older man who had not spoken once since collecting her from the town square, pulled to a stop and gestured silently for her to disembark. Marla stepped down into silence. The air smelled of old rain and smoke that no longer burned. Her shoes, too soft for this place, sank into the damp earth. She expected anyone to greet her, a steward, a servant, perhaps the prince himself, as the royal notice had suggested. The chosen bride shall be welcomed by his grace at the hour of dusk. But the courtyard stood empty, wind curling through the grass like fingers through forgotten hair. A crow shifted on a window so far above and gave a single cry, sharp and brief, like a warning. For a moment she considered whether this was some elaborate test, a riddle in disguise. She had read of such things, how noble brides were sometimes made to wait in silence for a sign of their worth. But the silence here felt too deep, too forgotten to be deliberate. It had the heavy stillness of places that had long since stopped expecting anything at all. A shuffling sound to her left startled her from thought. She turned and saw a boy, no older than 10, emerging from the base of the courtyard's outer wall. He wore a coat too large for his frame and boots that did not match. One leather, one wood, his dark hair sticking up in tufts as if he'd just risen from sleep. He did not bow, did not speak at first, just stared with a strange intensity, his eyes sharp as broken glass but not unkind. "You're her?" he asked finally, voice scratchy with suspicion, or maybe disuse. The new one. Marla opened her mouth, then closed it. She had rehearsed what she might say upon arriving. Courtesies, formal greetings, soft declarations of gratitude. But all those words felt too fine now, like lace set before fire. She settled on honesty. "I suppose I am," she said quietly. The boy tilted his head, studied her like one might study a beetle pinned to a board. They said he was sending a bride. "A common one. That's you, right?" She nodded. "Yes." He glanced past her toward the now empty coach. "Well, you're late. Dell thought you wouldn't come." Before she could ask who Dell was, the boy turned and began walking, not toward the main steps of the keep, but down a narrow path that skirted the courtyard's edge, half hidden by tall grass. Marla hesitated, then followed, her skirts dragged against the stone. Somewhere in the upper windows, a shutter creaked open, then closed again. The path led to a side entrance in the east wing, an arched doorway framed in ivy and chipped stone. The boy pushed it open and stepped inside. Marla paused at the threshold. The scent hit her first, wood smoke, milk gone sour, something damp and floral beneath it all. The corridor beyond was dim and crooked, lit only by a row of wall sconces with half-burnt candles. The boy did not wait for her. She followed. They moved through twisting halls, past rooms with doors ajar. She caught glimpses, threadbare blankets draped over broken chairs, boots too small left beside coal hearths, a cracked portrait hung upside down. Children's voices echoed faintly, a mixture of laughter and argument. Marla's heartbeat slowed, deepened. There were no guards. No servants. No prince. He led her into a wide room where 7 children sat in loose configurations around the floor. Some with paper scraps, others with bits of string or toy parts. They all looked up as she entered. The oldest among them, a girl with ginger braids and a faint scar across her left cheek, stood first. "She's here," the boy announced simply. The girl crossed her arms. "We thought maybe he changed his mind, or that you got eaten by wolves or something." "I didn't," Marla replied, trying to keep her voice even. One of the smaller girls, dark-skinned with wide, solemn eyes, stepped closer. "Are you really going to be our mom?" The question struck her like a stone under thin water, barely visible, but sharp when it hit. Marla opened her mouth, then hesitated. The words would have come easily in her village. "Of course not," or "I'm here for the prince," felt strange now, out of place in the presence of these thin-limbed, unblinking children. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. The red-haired girl tilted her head. "You're sleeping in the nursery. It's warmest." Finn snores, though. "Finn," the boy with the mismatched boots, simply grunted and sat down beside a toy soldier missing at arms. No one asked her name. No one asked where the prince was, as though both those facts had stopped matching long ago. Instead, they handed her a chipped cup of warm cider, sour but welcome, and the girl with the scar, Dell, she later learned, showed her to a narrow bed beside the hearth. A thin blanket, a pillow that smelled faintly of pine and dust. Marla sat down slowly, clutching the cup in both hands. The wind rose outside. Somewhere in the upper floors, something heavy fell. No one flinched. That night, long after the children had fallen asleep curled in pairs like foxes in a den, Marla sat by the nursery window and watched the moon rise over the dead garden below. Her dress wrinkled around her knees. Her hair had come loose in strands. She felt not like a bride, but like a stray that had been let in for the storm. She thought of the prince's promise, of the scroll that had arrived by pigeon, sealed in wax with a royal crest. A bride of common blood, pure of heart, shall be wed to his grace and receive full title and place. It had sounded like salvation, like escape. But here, in this castle full of echoes and orphans, with a throne room locked and a prince missing, she felt none of the certainty she'd clung to during the long journey. Just a strange, aching suspicion that she had been chosen not for love or for duty, but for something far quieter, something half forgotten. That night, in her sleep, she dreamed she stood alone in a chapel, dressed in blue, holding a bouquet of seaweed and salt. At the altar waited no man, only 7 children in masks, watching her with hollow eyes. The windows shattered one by one, letting in wind that smelled of the sea. And in the dream, she did not run. She simply stood, waiting. Marla woke with the sound of footsteps. Not hurried ones, but soft and deliberate, the kind of footsteps made by bare feet on old wood. She blinked in the dim morning light that pooled along the nursery floor like pale mist, her body stiff from sleep. The cot she had been given was narrower than she was used to, the mattress thin and dented in the middle, but it was warm and, more importantly, dry. The children were already awake. Some whispered to one another in a half-circle near the hearth, while others crouched in the far corner of the room with what looked like spoons and a broken pot, staging a breakfast of imagination. No one had woken her. They had simply let her sleep, as though understanding instinctively that her arrival had cost something invisible. She sat up slowly, tucking the wool blanket around her legs. One of the older girls, Dell, the one with the ginger hair and a faint scar, noticed she was awake and offered a curt nod of acknowledgement, the kind adults gave when pretending not to care. A moment later, a younger girl with tightly wound braids and the eyes of someone who had seen hunger up close, approached with a crust of bread in her outstretched hand. It was hard and slightly stale, but Marla took it with both palms as though it were an offering. The child didn't speak, only nodded once, then returned to her place near the hearth, where a few of the others were watching the embers with a mixture of reverence and boredom. The room was quieter than it should have been with 7 children in it, and Marla felt this not as a comfort, but as a kind of warning. Children left alone too long either became wild or solemn. These ones had chosen solemn. They moved carefully, as if trying not to disturb something always listening just beyond the walls. Their games were quiet, their arguments brief and whispered. No shrieking, no laughter that lasted more than a moment. They carried the weight of silence too large for their years, and it pressed on Marla from every corner. She rose and crossed the nursery, past a bookshelf missing most of its shelves, toward a warped window that looked out onto the eastern courtyard. The view was mostly overgrown grass and a crumbling statue whose face had been worn away by time or vandalism. She couldn't tell which. Beyond that, the main keep stood in slanted morning shadow, its windows dark. She searched again for movement, for servants opening shutters, for the prince stepping out into the light. But the castle remained still. She felt a tightness in her chest that had nothing to do with fear, and everything to do with the slow unraveling of hope, the way something precious fades not with thunder, but with quiet, persistent erosion. When she turned back, the children had begun gathering their things. Scarves were tied, coats shrugged on, boots tugged over small feet. Dell handed out small bundles of dried apple and nuts, and the boy with the mismatched boots, Finn, she now knew, stood by the door with a look that was more command than invitation. "Come on," Dell said without looking at her. "We got chores." It took a few seconds for Marla to understand she was included. There was no question of her remaining behind, no assumption that she was still a guest. She wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and followed them through the crooked hallways of the east wing, the stone cold beneath her shoes. The corridors branched like roots, twisting and intersecting in ways that felt less designed than grown. She noticed how the children navigated them without hesitation, ducking beneath low arches, skipping the step that creaked near the eastern stair, avoiding a certain hallway entirely. It was as though they had absorbed the castle into their very bones, memorizing it through necessity rather than design. They emerged into what must once have been a servant's courtyard. Weeds pushed through the stones, and a well sat dry in the center, its roof rotted and sagging. There were chickens, thin and scraggly, and a goat that bleated once, lazily. The children scattered into motion. One began collecting eggs. Another swept the porch steps with a bundle of twigs tied together with string. Finn disappeared toward the woodshed with an axe nearly as tall as he was. Marla, unsure what to do, knelt beside the small girl who had given her bread and offered her hands in silent question. The child smiled, just a flicker, and handed Marla a tin basin filled with wet linens. They worked side by side at the edge of a frost-covered trough, scrubbing and wringing, the water biting and sharp. The cold brought clarity, and in its wake, questions began to collect like rain in a basin. After some time, Marla asked quietly, "Where's everyone else?" The girl did not stop scrubbing. "Gone," she said. A beat passed. The maids left first, then the soldiers, then the cooks. Some ran, some didn't say nothing. Marla waited, and the prince. This time the child paused, her hands stilled in the water. He said he'd be back when the right one came. He said not to open the big door unless she was her. Before Marla could ask what that meant, the girl had moved on to another task. Marla stood slowly, her hands numb, and watched the others work. They were efficient, practiced, far more than children ought to be. She realized then that none of them were older than 12. No adults, no guardians, just the 7 of them, orphaned or abandoned or perhaps something more complicated, keeping the castle from falling entirely into ruin. After chores, they returned to the east wing and gathered around the long table in the former servants' hall. Marla helped distribute the food, flatbread, stewed turnips, weak tea, and no one spoke much while eating. Hunger, she knew, made conversation feel like indulgence. Afterward, some of the children drifted to their rooms for lessons. Dell stayed behind and began cleaning the hearth, and it was only then that Marla dared to ask again. "Dell," she said gently, "what happened here? Why is the throne room locked?" Dell didn't answer at first. She pushed a bit of ash into a pan, then stood and wiped her hands on her skirt. "It locked the day the prince went in," she said finally. "He told us he was waiting for her. The bride. Said he'd know if she was the right one when she opened the door. He never came back out. We left food outside sometimes, and it would be gone. Sometimes we hear footsteps or a chair dragging. But he doesn't talk. Not anymore." Marla felt the chill return to her limbs. This time not from cold, but from the knowledge that she had stepped into something far stranger than loneliness. A man behind a locked door. 7 children left to tend the shell of a kingdom. And a prophecy. Of sorts, that placed her in the center of it. That afternoon, the wind picked up. Rain came in slow, slanting sheets. The castle moaned with it, as if remembering pain. Marla found herself alone in the library, a circular room with half its shelves collapsed and the rest thick with dust. She ran her fingers along the spines of crumbling books, noting how many had been chewed by mice or rotted through. One caught her eye, a journal half-filled, the ink smudged. The writing was spidery, slanted. She could make out only one clear phrase on the inside cover. If she comes, let her find them first. That night, as the children lay curled in quilts sewn from old banners and pillowcases stitched into patchwork, Marla remained by the nursery fire. Her feet ached, her dress stained with ash and water, her hair twisted into a knot of damp. She should have felt foolish, angry even, but instead she felt something stranger, the dull ache of recognition, the kind that came not when meeting someone new, but when finally returning to a place you had dreamed of without knowing it. The wind howled outside, pressing against the glass. Somewhere deeper in the castle, a door creaked on its hinge. Marla looked toward the hall, then back at the children, and knew she would not leave in the morning. Even if the coach returned, even if a letter came, she would stay, because someone had to. In the first days that followed her arrival, Marla moved to the castle as though wading into a half-frozen river. Slowly, cautiously, not yet sure whether it would numb or cleanse her. The air in the great halls was cold enough to bite through wool, and the smell of abandonment lingered in every corridor. Damp stone, burnt oil, mildew thickening beneath the once gilded ceilings. Dust floated like ash in the shafts of light that managed to slip through cracked windows, and everywhere she walked, the hush of the place seemed to deepen, as if the walls were waiting for her to speak first. The castle was not dead, but had forgotten how to be awake. She began to explore its rooms not out of curiosity, but necessity. The pantry shelves had grown bare, and the children needed clothes thicker than threadbare nightshirts as the wind sharpened with autumn's steady turn. Marla found the sewing room in the western hall, tucked behind a crooked door near the servants' quarters. It smelled of mice and linseed oil. A bolt of moth-eaten green velvet lay curled like a sleeping dog across the table, and beneath it, spools of thread, mostly faded and broken, filled the drawers like old bones. She gathered what she could carry and brought it back to the east wing, where the hearth still burned through the mornings and the children gathered each evening as if the fire itself was something holy. There, with the windows closed against the cold and a patchwork rug beneath her knees, she began to sew. She unpicked old curtains from abandoned chambers, cut them into sleeves and trousers, lined them with strips of flannel pulled from ruined bedding. It was slow work, her fingers stiff from years of fish scales rather than needles, but she moved carefully, as she had when stitching nets on fog-wet mornings beside her father's boat. Dell watched her in silence at first, then joined her without asking. Together they taught the others to thread needles, to hem with uneven but persistent lines. Finn never spoke, but he would sit nearby, carving shapes into the ends of broken chair legs, his eyes flicking often toward Marla, as if measuring her against some invisible standard she could not yet see. It was during one of these long afternoons that she discovered the locket. She had returned to the sewing room alone to search for more fabric and noticed, in the slant of late sun across the floorboards, a glint beneath the warped edge of the stairwell. She knelt, pushed aside a panel that shifted under her hand, and there it was, half buried in dust, the silver dulled but still intact. Oval, simple, its hinge rusted. When she opened it, the clasp stuck briefly, then gave with a sigh. Inside were 2 miniatures, one a young man in a military coat, brow solemn, hair neatly combed, and the other of a child, perhaps 4 years old, with curls so pale they were nearly white. Marla traced the curve of their painted faces with her thumb, then closed the locket and tucked it into her apron pocket, without knowing why. It felt wrong to leave it there, like stepping past a candle left burning too long. The castle revealed itself slowly, not through grand gestures, but in the quiet offerings of things long forgotten. In the mornings, She ventured deeper, through ballrooms whose chandeliers hung crooked and floorboards that sighed with age. In one room, she found a harpsichord with broken strings and a single intact stool. In another, a nursery locked on the inside, its door scratched faintly with the names of children she did not know. She found corridors that ended in blank stone, staircases that vanished into rot, and a gallery of portraits that had been turned to face the wall, their frames wrapped in linen like shrouds. She never touched the locked throne room, not yet, but sometimes in the hours just before dawn, when even the wind seemed to rest, she would pass its door and feel the pulse of something still living behind it. Not movement, exactly, but presence, like the warmth left in a chair when someone has just stood. The children adapted to her presence, not with affection, but with a kind of cautious absorption, the way the earth takes rain. They watched her more than they spoke to her, as though waiting to see whether she would fade like the others had. One morning, Marla caught Letha, the smallest girl, the one with the solemn eyes, watching her from the stairs. Their gazes met. Letha did not blink. "You staying?" she asked, the word so sudden that Marla nearly dropped the tin of flowers she was carrying. Marla set it down. "Do you want me to?" Letha shrugged. "Some left at night. Some said they'd come back. Didn't." "I'm not like them," Marla said. "Why not?" Marla didn't answer right away. She thought of the sea, of her mother's hands, of the letter that had changed her life with only 27 words. She thought of her father's face the night she left, how he hadn't cried, only held her shoulder too tightly, as though trying to memorize the shape of her for when memory was all he had left. She thought of the silence in the coach and the boy with the mismatched boots and the bread that Dell had handed her as if it were a torch. "Because I don't want to leave," she said at last. Letha seemed to accept this. She nodded once, then turned and padded down the hall, her footsteps light as feathers on old wood. In time, Marla began to teach. Not formally, not at a desk or with chalk and board, but in quiet moments folded between chores. She showed them how to stitch names into the hems of their sleeves, how to heat stones to warm their beds, how to mend shoes with twine soaked in wax. She brought out paper she found in the steward's office and taught them to write their names, then the names of others, then stories they made up or half remembered from books too damaged to read. Dell took to it quickly. Finn resisted, but when he thought no one was looking, he practiced on bits of wood. Letha began drawing birds with wings too large and eyes too sad. They began to laugh more. Not loudly, not often, but enough to fill the nursery with something more than breath and firelight. Marla cooked when there was food to cook. Soups from withered turnips, stews from beans and old onions, flat cakes when she could barter flour from the village boy who delivered once a fortnight and never looked her in the eye. She kept a list of what they had, scratched into the underside of the cupboard door with a nail, and another what she dreamed of having: milk, honey, apples, wool for winter cloaks. She stopped looking for letters. None came. The prince did not appear. The throne room stayed closed. But one afternoon, as the wind blew in heavy with the scent of pine and rain, Marla heard footsteps in the corridor outside the sewing room. Slow, dragging, deliberate. She stepped into the hall. No one was there. Only the candle on the wall had gone out, though no draft could be felt. She relit it and said nothing to the children. That night, she sat beside the fire, the locket still in her apron pocket, her hands moving steadily over a pair of mittens she was stitching from an old woolen shawl. The children were asleep, their breathing soft, rhythmic. Outside, the castle groaned with the cold. Marla stared into the flames, and for the first time since her arrival, she began to imagine a future not marked by waiting, not by prophecy or titles or man locked behind a door, but by small things: warm bread, laughter, names stitched into cuffs, a hallway filled with footsteps that returned. She would not wait for the prince. She would not try to find out if she was the one he had spoken of. Not yet. For now, she would stay and build something from her ruins, not because she had been chosen, but because they were still here, because they needed more than hope. They needed someone who would stay. The morning Finn disappeared began as most mornings did, with the wind combing through the eastern trees and a quiet that settled early across the castle like a dusting of ash. Marla had risen before the others, stirred by a dream she could no longer recall, and gone to the scullery to grind oats into meal. The fire had already gone cold in the kitchen hearth, so she gathered kindling with fingers stiff from the lingering frost and struck the flint until sparks caught in the pile of old, splintered letters she'd begun using for tinder. Smoke curled upward slowly, hesitantly, like everything in this place, and for a long while she stood there just watching it rise, arms folded, the ache in her back more familiar now than unwelcome. She noticed Finn's absence only when the rest of the children filed into the hall, rubbing their eyes, combing their fingers through tangled hair, their voices still soft with sleep. Letha tugged at the sleeve of her nightdress and asked if there would be honey, and Dell shook her head at once without looking up from the tin she was prying open. Marla looked across the room, toward the bench where Finn usually sat in the corner nearest the hearth, legs tucked under himself like a cat. It was empty, his blanket still rumpled in the cot beside the wall, a small pair of boots set neatly underneath as if it expected to return. "Where's Finn?" she asked too casually. Dell glanced up, then frowned. "He was here last night. I saw him sharpening his knife." Letha nodded. He gave me his half of the biscuit, said it was too sweet. No one else had seen him since. Marla pressed her lips together, pushed the pot to the edge of the fire, and told them all to eat slowly. She left Dell in charge, laced her boots tightly, pulled on her cloak, and stepped out into the wind with a scarf tied around her head. The cold had deepened in the last few days. There was no snow yet, but the ground had hardened and the leaves had turned crisp and sour on the trees. She walked the perimeter of the east wing first, then moved past the old stables, where the roof had half collapsed and the scent of rot hung heavy in the beams. The chapel stood silent and roofless, its altar green with moss. She called his name twice, but knew better than to expect an answer. It was as she circled the central courtyard for the second time that she saw the trail, small boot prints, sharp in the mud, cutting toward the western corridor that had once led to the throne room. Her breath caught. No one went near that place anymore, not because it was forbidden, but because it had come to feel like the belly of some ancient creature, sleeping and vast. The children avoided it instinctively. Even Marla, brave enough to stitch blankets from military banners and barter soup from stale bread, had never dared to press close to the door. She followed the prince carefully. The corridor darkened as she moved, the torches long dead in their brackets, and the air grew colder, not with a clean chill of morning, but the kind that lingered in stone, the breath of rooms too long closed. At the end of the corridor, the great door loomed, tall, oak dark, metal-strapped, unornamented except for a ring-shaped handle tarnished by time. Finn knelt before it motionless, as though in prayer. Marla paused, unsure whether to speak or simply wait. He did not turn when she approached. His back was straight, hands resting on his knees, the kind of stillness that seemed not born of calm, but of absolute concentration. She knelt beside him slowly, letting the silence settle around them. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, almost a whisper. "Why did you come here?" Finn's eyes stayed on the door. "He's not dead," he said, as a continuing conversation already in progress. "I can hear him. Sometimes he walks around. Sometimes he sits in the chair. He sings, but not real songs. Just sounds." Marla swallowed. "You've heard this before?" Finn nodded. "I think he's waiting." "For what?" Finn's gaze shifted then, not to her, but to the keyhole in the center of the door. "For you." The word settled in Marla's chest like a dropped stone in deep water. She reached out and touched the door lightly. The wood was cold, but not lifeless. There was something beneath it, a pressure, a hum, a silence that did not feel empty, but full with held breath. She stood slowly, pulled Finn gently to his feet, and turned them both away. The boy did not resist. They walked back through the corridor together, her hand on his shoulder. That night, after the children had eaten and drifted into their cots like leaves settling into earth, Dell approached Marla by the hearth. Her face, always so sharp in the daylight, looked old in the firelight, the scar on her cheek a pale thread across her skin. "He used to talk about it," she said without preamble. "The prince, before he went into the throne room, said there'd be someone who could open it, not with a key, with something else." Marla didn't ask what. She had begun to understand that the things they believed were stitched from 1,000 frayed threads, memories of real things, hope spoken aloud too many times, and the strange certainty that comes from pain endured in silence. He said she wouldn't come for the crown, Dell added, voice quieter now. Said she'd come for us. Later, when the castle had gone still again, Marla sat beside the fire and took the locket from her apron. She turned it in her hand slowly. It felt heavier than before. She opened it, stared at the faces, tried to trace a resemblance to the boy behind the door. She saw none, but still she slipped it over her neck and tucked it beneath her dress, the metal cool against her skin. In the days that followed, she returned to the throne room door once more, not to speak, not to knock, but simply to sit, to listen. And though she never heard footsteps or a song, never caught the scrape of a chair leg or the creak of leather, she began to feel it again, that sense of waiting, of something withheld, not sleeping, not dead, just delayed. She stopped dreaming of weddings. The image that had once haunted her, the candlelit chapel, the seaweed bouquet, the 7 children in masks, no longer came. In its place were smaller dreams, a roof patched, a child laughing in the garden, a bowl of milk warm from the goat, and a spoon carved by Finn's own hands. She began to wonder what it meant to open something, if it required courage or grief, or the simple act of choosing to stay. Then, on a morning swept clean by wind and cloudless sky, she found Letha curled on the steps of the East Tower, her arms around her knees, her breath shallow and uneven. Marla knelt, touched her forehead, and felt the heat bloom through her fingers. Fever, sudden, deep, unrelenting. Dell ran for herbs. Finn brought water from the well. Marla carried the child to the nursery and stayed at her side through the day, changing cloths, whispering stories, combing her fingers through hair soaked with sweat. By evening, the fever had not broken. Marla stepped into the corridor, leaned her head against the cold stone, and closed her eyes. For the first time since arriving, she prayed, not with words, but with longing so fierce it burned. She prayed not to kings or gods or princes behind doors, but to something simpler, to the earth, to the fire, to whatever still watched over children abandoned and women who stayed. That night, she dreamed of the throne room again. But this time, she stood before it not as a supplicant, not as a bride, but as herself, mud-stained, hollow-eyed, weary and real. The door creaked open. She did not see who stood inside, only a chair facing the window and light streaming in like forgiveness. When she woke, Letha was breathing evenly. The fever had broken. The children rejoiced in their quiet way, bringing her broth and dolls, tucking flowers into her pillowcase. Marla said nothing, only kissed the girl's forehead and went back to her mending. Her hands trembled as she stitched, not with fear, but with the slow understanding that something had shifted, not outside, within her. She did not know yet what waited behind the door, but she was beginning to understand what it meant to be the one it waited for. The letters began as instinct, a habit of structure, when the rest of the world had unraveled. Marla wrote them at the edge of the nursery table once the children had gone to sleep, her candle guttering in a glass saucer beside her, and a sheet of salvaged parchment curled at the edges with age. At first, they were written with a sense of obligation, one to the village elders who had selected her, one to the crown's registrar in the capital, one to the church that had blessed her journey. She addressed each carefully, her script clean and deliberate, and wrote as though her life still belonged to the threads of civility that had brought her here. She told them of her safe arrival, of the children in her care, of the prince's absence. She did not speak of the locked room. She did not write about the dreams or the silence behind the door that felt less like emptiness and more like the weight of breath held far too long. She sealed each envelope with wax from the drippings they collected for winter candles, marked them with a pressed thimble to mimic a seal, and left them by the stone gate for the boy who passed by every fortnight with a basket of stale bread and a handful of eggs. He never lingered, barely spoke, but took what was offered and gave what he had. When she asked him once if he would carry the letters to the next post house, he only nodded. Whether he did or not, she would never know. Weeks passed and no answers came. Marla kept writing, not for the responses, but because something in her refused to fall entirely into silence. She wrote of the changing leaves and the repairs they had made to the east wing, of Dell's handwriting improving, of the way Finn had carved a bird that almost looked alive. She wrote of Letha's recovery and the strange, steady hum that came from the walls on windless nights. The more she wrote, the more the tone shifted, the formality loosened. The sentences grew longer, more honest. She began to confess things she did not say aloud, not even to herself. How she feared the day the children would grow too old to need her. How she could no longer picture the prince's face, only the hollow of his absence. How she sometimes wished the throne room would open not with a sign, but simply with a key, something she could hold in her hand. One evening, in a sudden gust of grief, she burned a letter before it was ever folded. She did it slowly, feeding it corner by corner into the fire, watching the ink curl into unreadable loops. The silence afterward felt clean. She began to explore the library with a different purpose, not for stories or history, but for truths hidden between the cracks. The room had once been magnificent. That much was clear. The shelves rose to the vaulted ceiling, though many had collapsed or leaned dangerously. She cleared a space beneath a cracked window where the light slanted in best and began organizing what remained. Most of the books were ruined, pages blackened by moisture, ink run to blurs, but some still held. A volume of dried herbs, a history of the War of the Broken Crown, a children's primer with half the pages torn. She set them aside carefully, cleaned them with cloth and patience. It felt like building a world from the ruins of another. It was in one of the older tomes, spine split, binding loose, that she found the journal, tucked inside a hollowed-out space in the back cover. It was small, leather-bound, its clasp broken, the edges smudged with soot. Inside, the handwriting slanted upward, confident and quick. The pages were dated 2 years prior. The name written on the first page in faint ink, Cohen Adriel. She sat down with it as the light waned and read until her hands grew numb. The journal did not read like the writings of a prince. There were no declarations of state, no strategies of war, no mention of treaties or council meetings. Instead, there were sketches, rough outlines of faces, figures curled in sleep, fragments of poetry so raw they read like wounds. There were entries about the children, though not by name. He referred to them as shadows at first, then lanterns. There were passages about grief, about shame, about returning from battle, and finding nothing left that made sense. He wrote the silence that followed victory, of the way celebration rang hollow against the memories of blood-soaked ground. He wrote about a woman, not named, who would come not with fanfare but with bread, who would arrive not to rule, but to gather what had been scattered. One entry held only a few lines. Asterisk if she comes, I will know her by her hands. Not soft, not cold, she will mend what I cannot, not with magic, not with power, with presence, asterisk. Marla closed the journal with trembling fingers. She did not cry. She only sat, listening to the wind claw at the edges of the broken window, her breath shallow, her chest full of something that felt less like destiny and more like fear. She did not tell the children about the journal. Not yet. Instead, she slipped it beneath the loose board beneath her cot, the same one that held the locket, and returned to the rhythm of her days. She mended sleeves, taught numbers, counted jars of beans, watched for signs of coal coming to the mortar. But something in her had shifted. She felt in the way she moved through the halls, how her footsteps grew slower near the throne room, how her hand brushed its surface each time she passed, a ritual without name. One morning, Finn handed her a carved piece of wood. It was a shape unlike any other he had made, rounded, flat, with a hole near the center. She turned it over in her hands. Puzzled, "It's the door," he said quietly, "the shape of the lock." She blinked, then realized. It was not a toy. It was a study. Later that day, she stood before the throne room once more. The door, tall and still, bore no mark. She traced the faint outline of the keyhole. It was indeed the same shape, but no key had been found. Not in all the rooms she had searched, not even in the prince's journals. She returned to the east wing and retrieved the locket. She had never thought to examine it closely. Sitting by the firelight, she pried open the back with the tip of a hairpin. Inside, beneath the miniature of the child, she found a second hinge, small, hidden, clever. With careful fingers, she eased it open. A key, no longer than her smallest finger, rested inside. Iron, dull with time. She did not weep. She did not gasp. She simply closed the locket and tucked it back against her chest, where it had rested all these weeks, warm from her skin. That night, she did not dream. But when she awoke, it was with the clarity of someone who had known something all along. She did not use a key. Not yet. Instead, she began to move through the castle differently. She no longer looked for permission. She rearranged rooms, opened windows long sealed, swept halls no one had entered for months. She found a harp in the music room. One string snapped, the other's brittle. She repaired it with fishing line, taught herself to coax music from it again. The children sat beside her in the evenings as she played, their eyes wide, their silence no longer heavy but full. She made a new chart on the wall of the nursery. Each child's name, a row of small marks for each skill they learned. When one reached 20, they got a ribbon sewn into their coat. Small things, symbols, proof that they were growing. Marla no longer waited for letters. She no longer wrote them. The last one she had penned, she folded gently and burned without reading. Its ashes she scattered in the garden, where bulbs slept beneath the hardening earth. And so, as the first snows came, as the trees shed their last leaves and the sky turned the color of pewter, Marla Thorne did not wonder if she had been chosen. She did not wonder what waited behind the door or whether it would open. She had already begun to build a world from what was left, and the key pressed lightly against her chest, patient as breath. Winter came not with ceremony, but with silence. It slipped beneath the doors and into the seams of the children's coats, hollowed out the warmth in the long halls, turned breath into smoke even indoors. The castle changed in the cold. What had once felt abandoned now seemed to brace itself against the world, bones of stone pulled tighter together. The corridors darker, the sound of wind to the towers a mournful voice that never stopped speaking. Snow fell for 3 days straight and covered everything. The orchard, the courtyard, the moss-stained steps, with shrouds so clean it felt like a razor. The garden vanished beneath it. The broken fountain disappeared. Even the statues lost their shapes, softened into faceless watchers wrapped in white. Inside, the fire never slept. Marla became a keeper of flame. She rose before the children each morning and kept the hearths fed with whatever could burn. Cracked chair legs, broken shutters, pages from books that had lost their meaning. Finn and Dell took turns splitting what remained of the firewood, their hands blistered beneath layers of cloth. They began wearing their coats indoors. Letha's cough returned, and the twins shared a blanket at night, curled into each other like foxes in a den. The pantry grew quieter, shelves hollowing out like rib cages. The potatoes sprouted soft eyes. The apples, stored in a bucket in the coldest corner, turned to sugar and rot. Marla rationed everything. 1 biscuit split 3 ways. A broth thickened only with memory. Still, they endured, not through optimism but routine. They learned to stitch socks from curtain scraps. They lined their boots with straw. When the well froze, Marla taught them to melt snow in tins set by the hearth. They learned to speak in low voices, to read by candlelight, to comfort each other without asking for comfort themselves. It was a kind of growing, not marked in height or age, but in the deepening of their silences, the way they watched her now not as an outsider, not even as a guardian, but as something closer to their own survival. She had not saved them from the cold, but she had stood inside it with them, and still, the door remained closed. The key lay hidden inside the locket, pressed to her chest each day, warmer now from the heat of her skin than it ever had been in the dark. Marla felt it there always, like a held breath. She did not tell the children she had found it, not because she wished to keep it from them, but because she did not know what opening that door might take away. In her dreams now, the door did not open to light or to royalty. It opened to a room full of mirrors, each one showing a different life she had not lived. Childless, married to a fisherman, widowed, forgotten, free. Each one felt real. Each one hurt. On the 7th night of snowfall, Letha's fever returned. It came like a thief, sudden and sharp, rising with the dusk and burning into her chest by midnight. Marla sat at her side with cloth and broth, whispering stories from her own childhood, ones with no princes, only boats and stormlight, only the sound of her mother's voice calling her in from the shore. The other children grew quiet, gathered in the corners of the room, unsure whether to hope or prepare. Dell refused to speak. Finn stayed awake through the night, sitting by the window, carving something she could not see. In the silence between Letha's breaths, Marla heard the castle speak again, not in words, but in the sound of it, the groan of timber, the sigh of walls pressed against wind, the faint creak of a corridor walked by no one. She had begun to recognize those sounds, to know when they were caused by the cold and when they were something else. That night, she heard footsteps again. Not close, not loud, just one after another, a slow pattern, a rhythm out of place with sleep or solitude. She rose from Letha's side, moved to the door of the nursery, and stood in the hallway. The sound had stopped, but something in the air had changed. It felt like standing before a thunderstorm. No rain yet, but the scent of it, the pressure of something vast about to arrive. She stepped into the corridor and moved slowly toward the western wing. The castle was colder there, always had been, as though that part of it had chosen not to remember warmth. She passed the music room, where the harp sat silent now. One string snapped again. She passed the shuttered gallery and the collapsed dining hall. And then she was at the end of the hall, facing the throne room door. The key pulsed beneath her dress. She raised her hand to the handle but did not touch it. Instead, she leaned forward, rested her forehead gently against the wood, and closed her eyes. "I'm still here," she whispered, "but not for you." She stood that way for a long time. The door did not move. Nothing shifted, but the silence deepened again, as it always did when the castle listened. The next morning, Letha opened her eyes. Her fever had broken in the final hour before dawn. She drank water slowly, blinking at Marla as if from the other side of a long winter. The children gathered around her with a reverence usually reserved for saints. Dell wept quietly into her sleeve. Marla held Letha's hand and felt a strength returning that was not just physical, but something more stubborn, resilience born not of recovery but of witness. The child had passed through something and returned. That afternoon, Marla went to the chapel. The roof had long since fallen in, and snow covered the altar in drifts, but she cleared a place on the stone and knelt beside it. She didn't pray. She hadn't believed in God since the sea took her brother when she was 7, but she spoke softly to whatever listened from the roots of things. "Let me keep them," she said. "That's all." As she rose, something caught her eye beneath the edge of the altar, a scrap of cloth. She pulled it free and found, to her surprise, the veil she had arrived in, folded carefully, hidden, preserved. She hadn't seen it in months. It should have been lost or ruined, but here it was whole. As she turned it in her hands, she felt a weight shift inside it. She unfolded the edge and found the iron key nestled there, fallen from the locket during some forgotten moment, held within the fabric like a seed in soil. She stared at it, then closed her fingers around it, not with awe, but with a quiet certainty. That evening, she returned to the nursery and played the harp with one string missing. The sound was uneven, strange, but still beautiful in its own way. The children sat close. They had grown thinner, but their eyes were bright. Finn placed something in her lap when she finished playing, a carving, not an animal this time, but a house. Tiny, detailed, complete with a door and windows. She turned it over. On the underside, he had scratched a single word, "Home." Marla held it in her palm for a long time. She did not look at the throne room again that night. She no longer felt fear when she passed it. What lay behind it had become less myth and more mirror. Not a prince, not a destiny. Just a man who had once waited for something he did not understand. The key stayed in her apron pocket. She did not forget it, but she also did not reach for it. She had made a decision in the dark, beside a fevered child, beside a heart that had not gone out in spite of everything. She would open the door when it no longer felt like an answer, only when it felt like a continuation. The days lengthened by minutes, imperceptibly at first, then more surely, as though time itself had begun to thaw from beneath the snow. The castle, slow to respond, seemed to heave in quiet relief. Icicles that clung to the eaves like teeth began to drip, and the river that curved through the woods below gave voice again to its slow, sibilant song. Marla woke one morning to the sound of birds, only two, uncertain their song but alive. She sat upright in her cot with a start, unsure at first whether she was still dreaming. But the sound remained delicate and tentative, as if the season itself had forgotten how to begin. Inside, the east wing remained dim, though the rooms were brighter now for the absence of desperation. Letha had recovered. Her cough had faded into memory, and her cheeks bloomed again with that deep, steady warmth children were when they are no longer fighting to survive. Dell spent hours at the table drawing plans or a pulley to bring up water from the well, her brow furrowed in serious focus. Finn had carved 4 animals in as many days: a fox, a heron, a bear, and finally a figure that Marla realized only when he handed it to her was meant to be her. Its face was only a soft curve of wood, but the posture was unmistakable, upright, still, watching. There was food now, barely enough, but enough. The merchant boy had begun to arrive more frequently with his satchel of potatoes and flour, and Marla no longer had to trade away fabric for oats. The chickens had laid again, 2 eggs, warm and brown as stone, and the goat's belly was heavy with promise. There was the faintest scent of something growing in the garden beneath the snow, and though no one said aloud, the children began to move with something that resembled ease. It was not happiness, not quite, but the first true rest they had known in many months. Marla began to spend more time alone in the chapel, not for prayer, but for stillness. She would sit beneath the broken arch of what had once been a window and watch the sky grow pale in the mornings, the sun catching against the snow's crusted skin. She brought the veil with her now, folded neatly in her lap, and with it, the iron key. She would hold them both without purpose, simply to remember what they meant, that she had come here for one reason, and stayed for another entirely. The key was smooth in her hand, worn at the teeth, small enough to lose in a pocket, but heavy enough to shift the weight of her thoughts. Some nights, she pressed it against her palm until it left an imprint on her skin. She never showed it to the children. She never spoke of it aloud. But she knew that the time to use it was drawing close, not out of curiosity or prophecy, but because something inside her had ripened. The question no longer frightened her. What lay behind the door was no longer a legend. It was a truth long buried, and it was time. Then one morning, as she swept the frost on the stone step outside the nursery, she noticed Dell standing still in the doorway, eyes fixed on her hand. Marla followed her gaze and saw that the key had slipped from her pocket and lay in the snow beside the broom, dull and silver, catching the first light of the morning. Neither of them moved for a long moment. Then Dell bent slowly, picked it up, and turned it in her palm. "You had it all this time," she said, not with accusation, but with quiet recognition. Marla straightened. "I didn't know how to tell you." Dell looked down at the key again, then back at her. "You waited," she said simply. "Good." That evening, Marla gathered the children in the great hall, not because she had decided on a speech, but because there was no longer any reason to delay. They sat close together, bundled in mismatched cloaks and scarves, the fire crackling low behind them. Marla stood at the hearth, the key in her hand. The children waited. "I came here thinking I was meant to marry a prince," she began. "That's what the letter said, that I was chosen. I don't know if that was ever true. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe he didn't mean me. But I stayed because of you." She paused. Letha reached for her hand, and Marla curled her fingers around the girl's instinctively. "There's a door in this castle," she continued. "You know it. You've all felt it. Behind it is a man who locked himself away a year ago. Some say he's waiting. Some say he's lost. I don't know what I'll find, but I think it's time." No one interrupted. No one asked what would happen next. Finn nodded once. Dell stood. The others followed. Together, they walked the long corridor toward the throne room. The hall was colder here still, though less so than before, as if the castle itself had taken a breath. The sconces held fresh candles now, and their light stretched farther. The great door rose before them like the final page of a long story. The key fit easily in Marla's hand. She stepped forward, slowly, and the children hung back, watching with a reverence that made her throat tighten. She pressed the key into the lock. It resisted for only a moment before turning with a quiet click. The sound was unremarkable, and yet it echoed down the corridor like the pealing of some unseen bell. Marla closed her eyes, then pushed the door open. The throne room was not as she had imagined it. No gold, no banners, no crown atop a velvet pillow. Only dust, thick on every surface, and the dim light of afternoon falling through high stained glass windows. Their colors faded to smoke. The air was still, unmoving, the scent of old cedar and wax mingling with time. At the far end of the room, the throne sat crooked, one leg shorter than the others, and beside it, half in shadow, sat a man in a wooden chair. He was not dressed in finery. No sashes, no medals, no royal lines embroidered on his sleeves. He wore a wool coat, patched and simple, and a scarf wound loosely around his neck. His hair had grown long and gray at the edges. His hands rested in his lap. He did not rise. Marla took a step forward, then another, until she stood near enough to see the details of his face. Pale, thinner than she remembered from a portrait that hung, covered, in the hallway. His eyes met hers slowly, without surprise, as though he had known this moment would come exactly this way. "You're late," he said, voice low and rusted with disuse. "I waited," she replied. "So, did you?" He gave a small, brittle smile. "I thought if I stayed long enough, the world might fix itself. That if I removed myself, it would all heal." "It didn't," Marla said quietly. "But something else did." He looked past her then, to the children gathered behind the doorway. His gaze lingered. "They kept it alive," he said. "Not the castle. The meaning of it." Marla nodded. "And they're still waiting. But not for you. Not for kings. Just for a world that doesn't leave them behind." He looked down at his hands. "And what do you want?" "I want them to grow," she said. "I want them to laugh without looking over their shoulders. I want the walls to stop listening for sorrow." He nodded slowly. "I don't think I can be a prince anymore." "I don't need you to be," she said. He rose, slowly, using the arm of the chair for support. There was a tremble in his limbs, but he stood. "Then what now?" "We go back," she said. "To the hearth, to the garden. You learn their names." He looked at her, something behind his eyes cracking just slightly. "And yours?" "Marla." He stepped forward and followed her through the door. The children stepped back, parting for him not with deference, but with quiet curiosity. He met each of their eyes. Dell stared the longest. Letha reached for Marla's hand again. They walked back through the corridor together. Not a procession, a return. The castle breathed differently after the door opened. It was not a sudden thing, not a breaking a spell or an eruption of joy, but rather a shift almost imperceptible, like the moment just before the tide turns, when the ocean draws back not in retreat, but in preparation. There was no fanfare, no echo of prophecy fulfilled, no light pouring through vaulted ceilings. But something inside the old walls had altered, not in structure, but in rhythm. The silence, once so heavy with absence, began to carry a new weight, presence. The prince did not speak often, especially not in the first days. His name was not spoken loudly, and none of the children called him Your Grace. They did not bow. They did not flinch. They watched him with the wariness of those who had lived too long without certainties. And he, to his credit, made no demands. He did not sit on the throne, nor did he ask why it still stood wrapped in linen, its finials tarnished, its arms worn smooth with generations of grasping hands. He did not try to explain the year he had spent behind the door. If he was broken, he made no spectacle of it. If he carried guilt, he did not speak it aloud. Instead, he followed Marla each day through the work that kept the castle breathing. The first morning after, he joined her in the garden. Snow still covered most of it, packed in heavy drifts, but the southern edge had begun to thaw, exposing dark soil beneath the frost. Marla handed him a rusted spade without speaking. He took it. They worked side by side in silence, turning the ground, clearing debris, coaxing life from what had once been left to die. His movements were slow, his hands unsteady, but he did not complain. She watched the dirt gather beneath his fingernails and knew that this, more than any vow or confession, was proof of his willingness to remain. In the afternoons, he sat by the hearth with the children. At first, they stayed distant, clustered together in a knot of observation. Finn carved while pretending not to glance sideways. Dell continued her sketches, though her lines grew tighter, more precise, as if she was now aware of being seen by someone she once imagined gone. Letha, as always, was the first to bridge the distance. She climbed into Prince's lap one evening and handed him her doll, head half sewn back on, one eye missing. He took it carefully and cradled it as if it were a living thing. He said nothing, but the way his arms folded around her small body told them all what they needed to know. He began to listen, not with the guarded intensity of a man taking measure of his dominion, but with the quiet, deliberate care of someone relearning the names of things. He listened as Marla instructed the children on how to mend a torn hem, how to knead dough with the heel of the hand, how to test a draft in the chimney. He listened to Letha reading from a storybook with 2 pages missing, to Dell's explanations of how pulley systems worked, to Finn's rare observations, clipped and direct as chisel marks. He learned their rhythms, their silences, their laughter when it came, small but certain. He never asked Marla why she had stayed. He never asked what she had hoped for or what she had lost in coming. But sometimes, when the others had gone to sleep and only the fire remained between them, he would speak of the war, not with grandeur or grief, but with a flatness that made it harder to bear. He spoke of names forgotten before the earth covered them, of horses that fell mid-charge, of his own hands, trembling after the final battle, holding a crown he could not feel the weight of. He told her that when he returned to the castle, there had been a feast waiting, roast game, honeyed apples, men and women in pearls and brocade, and he had walked past them all, straight to the throne room, and locked the door behind him. It wasn't silence I wanted, he said one night, voice low and cracking with the hour. It was stillness. I thought maybe if I disappeared, the damage would settle, that it would run out of momentum, but it just found other places to land. Marla stirred the fire with an iron poker. The coals shifted, sighed, glowed deeper. She did not offer him absolution. She only said, "The castle didn't need you to vanish. It needed you to look. That's all." And he did look. Now, at the torn curtain, they repaired together in the music room. At the garden beds they planted with the last of the saved seeds. At the chipped plates, the dry well, the roof that still leaked in the west corridor. He did not command the children. He asked them. He told them stories, not of court or the war, but of his childhood, climbing apple trees, hiding from tutors, learning to catch frogs in the palace ponds. He laughed, slowly at first, then more easily. Marla once saw him smile while sweeping the library floor, and it startled her more than any ghost ever could. He slept in one of the guest rooms off the main hall, not the king's suite, not the royal chambers. A small room with a narrow bed, where the wind still crept in through a cracked window, and the ceiling bore a faded painting of stars. Marla passed by it once and saw him sitting on the bed, lacing his boots, the light from the corridor painting a soft edge along his jaw. He looked up and nodded. She nodded back. There was nothing else to say. She wondered sometimes what would happen if someone from the capital came, if a courier arrived with a decree, if a battalion of silver-armored guards demanded to know who now held the keys. But the world beyond the castle had stopped knocking. No letters came, no visitors. The roads were still frozen in places, the villages quiet, and here within the stone ribs of the castle, time moved differently, by the growth of seedlings, by the fading of bruises, by the number of times Letha laughed in a single day. One evening, Marla found a box in the chapel beneath the altar, tucked between the broken floor stones. Inside were things the children had hidden. Dell's first drawing, a tooth tied to a string, an empty bottle that once held oil, a scarf too small for anyone now. And beneath them all, folded carefully, a piece of parchment with a single sentence in the child's hand. "When she stays, we stay too." Marla placed the parchment beside the window in the nursery. She did not wear the locket anymore, but it remained on her shelf, open to the portraits. The key, used at last, now hung on a nail beside the hearth. No longer secret, no longer burden, just memory. One morning, the prince brought her a bouquet of garden weeds, bound together with twine. Dandelions, clover, a few snowdrops pushing through the thaw. He said, "It's not a crown, but they're still growing." Marla accepted them with a small smile and placed them in a chip jar of water on the table. That night, for the first time, she let the children bring their blankets into the great hall. They all slept there, curled in circles around the hearth, and Marla took the chair by the fire, the prince on the floor beside her. No one spoke. The flames rose, flickered, whispered. It was not a court. It was not a kingdom. It was not even a family, not in the way blood defines it. But it was theirs, and it was enough. The spring that followed was not easy, but it was full. It came in fits and starts, uncertain and clumsy like a colt learning to walk, and with it came work that left no room for hesitation. The snow melted slowly, revealing ground soaked and stubborn, mud that sucked at boots and coated the hems of every tunic. Marla and the children spent entire mornings clearing the garden of stones and rot, digging deep into the earth to make space for new roots. They planted beans, onions, beets, cabbage. The soil was hard, but the sun grew steadier with each passing day, and the wind lost its knife edge, growing warmer, carrying the scent of distant blooming things. They worked until their fingers blistered, until their backs ached, but it was a pain that led somewhere, a hunger that promised to be met. The prince, no longer referred to as such, not even in whispers, joined in every morning. He built a tool rack from discarded chair legs. He learned how to wrap seeds in soap paper before planting. He carried Letha on his shoulders when she grew tired. Her small hands tangled his hair like twine, and she giggled without reserve now, a sound that once had come rarely, now blooming like the violets sprouting beneath the chapel's stone wall. Dell sketched blueprints for a chicken coop, which they built over the course of 3 afternoons, and Finn built a sundial from broken marble and placed it near the garden path. Marla watched them with a quiet pride that settled deep in her bones, the kind that didn't announce itself but pulsed steadily beneath the skin, like to be a heart long made quiet and now returning to rhythm. There were still nights when the wind howled through the castle corridors, when the shutters banged and the fires hissed, and the walls remembered the weight of abandonment. There were days when the food ran low, when the goat kicked over the milk pail, when a sudden frost curled the edges of their seedlings and made Dell cry out in frustration. But they responded now with movement instead of fear. They rebuilt, replanted, woke early and stayed late. And at night, they shared what they had. A bowl of broth passed hand to hand, stories told in the glow of firelight, a quilt stitched together from pieces of memory, sleeves of ruined dresses, scraps of curtain, the hem of Marla's travel cloak. The prince, whose real name, Corwin, was rarely used and felt too formal when it was, slept each night in his narrow guest room and spent each day in the rhythm of shared survival. He never tried to lead, never raised his voice. But he was present, steady, if he still carried grief. He no longer folded himself into it. He laughed at Finn's dry jokes. He helped Letha with her numbers. He asked questions about how to trim the roots of the tomato seedlings and listened as Dell explained in great detail. When he read aloud, he chose books that had nothing to do with crowns or thrones or noble deeds. Books about animals, ships, wind, rivers. The children listened with heads resting against each other's shoulders, half asleep, their bodies soft with trust. Marla watched it all unfold not with surprise, but with reverence. It felt like tending to something ancient and sacred, not a legacy, not destiny, but healing. She kept her days full and her hands busy. She mended everything that frayed, socks, tempers, curtains. She taught the twins to bake bread and Letha to braid ropes. She sat with Finn while he carved and with Dell while she wrote her letters to no one. She let the prince help her without asking for help. She never gave him orders, but she did offer him tasks, and he accepted each one with a nod. She no longer saw the man who had once locked himself away. She saw a man building something without asking to be named for it. One evening in late spring, as the sky turned lavender and the smell of lilac reached the courtyard, the prince brought Marla a bundle wrapped in cloth. Inside was a journal hand-bound, the cover pressed from bark and dyed with crushed berries. The pages were stitched with wax thread, and the paper was rough, uneven. For the story, he said simply. She touched the cover with one finger and nodded. They said nothing more. She began writing in the journal that night, after the children had gone to bed. She did not begin with her own name, nor with the prince's, nor even with the castle. She began with the first night she arrived. The boy with the mismatched boots. The question, "Are you our new mother?" She wrote slowly, unsure whether she was recording or releasing, but the act soothed her, the sound of ink scratching across the page like stitching a wound shut. As the weeks passed, the castle softened. Vines grew across the cracks in stone. The air smelled of herbs and soil. Bees returned. A robin built its nest on the edge of the chapel window, and the children watched the chicks hatch with something close to awe. The throne room remained open but unused. Dust gathered there again, but gently, peacefully, as if marking time instead of decay. Marla went inside only once, to retrieve a chair for the garden, and when she stepped through the doorway, she felt nothing but a quietness that no longer asked anything of her. The room was no longer waiting. It had been fulfilled, not through coronation, but through continuity. They no longer marked time by the calendar pinned in the kitchen, which had stopped the winter before. They marked it by what had grown. First sprouts, first egg, first time the well did not freeze, first time Dell smiled without being prompted, first time Finn left a carving on Marla's pillow without signing it, first time Letha woke from a nightmare and did not cry. These were the moments that became holidays in their own way. And Marla, who had come to Castle expecting to be renamed, redefined, reborn, found instead that she had simply become more deeply herself. The village, far beyond the woods, sent no word. The world outside went on with its wars, its gossip, its kings and courts and carriages. But none of it reached them. No rider came to reclaim the throne. No herald arrived to inquire after the missing prince. Perhaps the world had forgotten them. Perhaps it had never truly known they were there. And still the castle lived. On the morning of the first full bloom, wildflowers, lavender, mustard grass, Marla stood by the garden and watched the children work. Letha watered. Dell measured. The twins hunted worms. Finn sat in the sun carving a name into the side of the chicken coop, East Wing Estate. It made her laugh. It was too grand for what they had, but maybe not for what they were becoming. The prince approached from the orchard, hands covered in soil, and offered her a piece of fruit. Small, green, not yet sweet. "First one," he said. She took a bite. It was bitter, but it filled her mouth with memory. She wiped her hands on her apron and reached for the journal tucked beneath her arm. "Shall we count this as harvest?" she asked. He nodded. They sat in the grass as the sun rose higher, the heat beginning to settle across the stone. Marla opened the journal, wrote the date in the corner of the page, and beneath it, a single sentence. Today, everything continued. She looked up at the children again and saw them as they were, no longer orphans, not quite a family, not subjects, not students. Just a gathering of lives choosing each other again and again. It was not the life she had expected. It was not the one she had been promised, but it was hers, and it was enough. Years passed as years tend to do, not all at once, but in the soft accumulation of seasons and small changes that settled over the castle like the slow layering of dust on old stone. The days were no longer counted in hardships or miracles, but in the ordinary rhythms that shaped the life Marla had grown into. The garden grew stronger each spring. The goat birthed twin kids that the twins named Juniper and Salt, and the east wing, once crumbling and damp, became the warmest part of the castle, patched and repaired with patience and the memory of survival. The children, once cautious, once half wild with abandonment, unfolded into themselves like seedlings turned toward light. Dell outgrew her old coat and stitched herself a new one from discarded velvet, dyed with crushed berries and rainwater. Finn began carving names into everything, not for vanity, but for permanence. He etched the alphabet along the doorframe of the kitchen, so that Letha could trace her fingers along it each morning and feel the shape of letters she now read with ease. The twins grew tall enough to reach the windowsills without standing on stools, and Letha, once the smallest, once so easily fevered, learned to climb the apple tree near the chapel in a single breathless motion. They were no longer children of a broken place. They were people of it, keepers of a history that was no longer painful to speak aloud. The prince grew older in quiet ways. His hair grayed fully, then thinned. His eyes, though softer, never lost their watchfulness. He became the one who taught fire starting, how to sharpen knives, how to recognize the sound of a cracked pipe in the walls. He read aloud each night from a rotating library they had gathered over the years. Books the children no longer feared would vanish. He helped write the names of each child into the leather-bound journal Marla kept beneath her bed, one name per page, each one accompanied by a drawing, a pressed flower, a carved token. He never returned to the throne room, not even once. The door remained open, but the dust claimed it slowly and without regret. No one asked when he would return to the capital. He never spoke of it, and neither did she. His world was here now, not by exile but by choice. A man who had once disappeared behind a door had found a life in the echoes that remained. Marla's hair turned silver at the temples, then through the braid entirely. She worked until her hands stiffened in the mornings, until her knees protested every stair, but she never gave her tasks away. The garden remained hers, the pantry list her script, the mending pile her meditation. When asked if she was tired, she smiled and said no, and it was a lie, not truly. Tiredness was something different than this. This was contentment shaped by time, by having lived through hunger, silence, waiting, and found that what came after was not glory but a kind of holy stillness, a life that asked only to be tended. In time, the children grew too large for the nursery. They moved into rooms once shut for years, scrubbing walls, dragging in beds, hanging their own drawings over cracked plaster. Letha took the tower room with the broken shutter, loving it for the birdsong. Finn claimed the smallest room beneath the eaves, preferring the sound of rain on slate. Dell stayed in the east wing longest, unwilling to part from the warmth of what they had once been. But even she left eventually, and her room was passed to the next girl who arrived, left at the castle gate by a distant cousin who said only, "She's been quiet for a long time." They welcomed her the way Marla had once been welcomed, not with answers, but with bread. Time became a circle rather than a line. Each spring they planted anew. Each winter, they sealed the cracks in the windows and dried herbs on the hearth hooks. The goats birthed, age passed. The chickens grew broody. The orchard bore fewer apples, but sweeter ones. The castle did not shine, but it endured, and Marla stayed through all of it, her days braided with others, her story now inseparable from the place she had once entered as a stranger. The prince died in his sleep on a cold morning just after the last harvest. It was Dell who found him, his hands folded over his chest, the locket Marla had once discovered resting against his heart. He had placed it there himself. No letter, no final words, just that an old token returned to its quiet place. Marla sat beside his bed until evening, holding his hand, not weeping, only remembering. She washed his body herself. The children helped dress him, wrapped him in linen and rosemary. They buried him at the edge of the orchard, beneath the tree where Letha had once fallen, and he had caught her. The stone they marked him with was simple, carved by Finn, who spent 3 days shaping it in silence. It read only, he stayed. Marla did not speak much that winter. Her joints ached more than they ever had, and her breath came slower when she walked. But the quiet was not absence. It was reverence. She moved through the rooms like a steward of something sacred, not guarding it, only carrying it until the next hand could take over. She began writing again, this time for herself. Not the story of how she came, but of what grew after. She wrote of the orchard in spring, of the time Finn had cried after accidentally killing a sparrow and buried it beneath the sundial. She wrote of the soup that had saved them in the year the snow came early, of the time Letha danced with fever just before it broke. She wrote of the way silence had changed, how it had become a resting place, not a void. She did not try to name what they had built. It had no title. It needed none. She died in her sleep 10 winters after the prince, in the cot she had never replaced. She left no letter, no farewell, only the journal, placed on the windowsill, its last page folded neatly with a pressed wildflower tucked inside. The children, grown now, some taller than she had ever been, some with their own voices, their own stories, found her before the fire, wrapped in the blanket Dell had sewn her the first year they had survived together. She looked peaceful, still, not empty, just finished. They buried her beneath the orchard, next to the prince. Between the roots of the tree they had planted together from seeds found in the old larder. It bore fruit now, golden and sweet, and birds nested in its arms. The stone dell carved for her was smaller, but she made sure the letters were deep, the kind that would not fade with the rain. It said only, she stayed, and around her they continued. Letha became a midwife, her hand steady, her voice calm. Finn traveled once, then returned, saying only, nothing out there felt like this. Dell began keeping the journal herself, now housed in a cupboard filled with the carved names of every soul who had slept under their roof. The castle, still no kingdom, still no court, became a place people whispered of, not for its prince, not for its door, but for its hearth, for its garden, for the way its children grew into keepers of something no one else had thought to preserve. No new letters came, no trumpets, no maps marked the place. But still, sometimes, a child would arrive at the gate, clutching a coat too small or a letter with no return, and they would be let in, always, handed bread, shown where the fire was warmest. No one asked them for lineage, for purpose, only whether they wished to stay. And so the story went on, not as a legend, not as a lesson, but as a house made of names, of laughter echoing in old stone, of silences filled with breath and music and mending. A story not of crowns, but of belonging,